Aloha students, how are we doing today? This is the last week of class, so let me tell you what's going to happen this week. Today will be the last day of content. These two subjects that you see up here, how about I put it this way, these are the last two WIDIPs of the course. How about that? Remember that conversation, write it down, periods. Tomorrow I'll give you an assignment which is really going to be your last assignment of the course, and it's going to be an evaluation of the content we've learned during this. You're going to evaluate the content that you've learned during this distance learning period. And we'll probably make that due on Thursday. And then you're going to write me a letter. I'll tell you what the subject matter of the letter will be on Wednesday. And I'm going to do sort of a final political spectrum thing for you to make sure you understand what's going to happen on the actual election day in November. And that'll be Thursday, and then Friday will be a goodbye day. We'll do a little trivia game hopefully that day as well. Okay, folks? All right, here we go. Try to keep up. I'm going to do these one at a time. These two are sort of interesting characters. You can see how I've set it up is these are going to be separate, so I'm going to pull this top one right here. Okay, so we're going to start with Gutenberg, and you can see one guy was born the year after the other guy died. Okay, the other guy died. Okay, so here we go. Let's start with this man. Many people consider him to be one of the most significant people of all of history. He was from Germany. He was basically an inventor. He was a pretty good. He was a businessman, is really what he was. And what we associate him with is the invention of what we all call the printing press, what basically is called mechanical printing. Now, he is not the inventor of printing. The Chinese actually invent that. The Chinese were way ahead on that. But they didn't invent a press. They didn't use necessarily metal to do what they were doing. But we associate Gutenberg with the printing press and that famous invention. All right? What's it based on? Well, there's been a lot of press machines in human history. Things that humans have invented to press something. Okay, so what can you think of that needs to get pressed? Well, I can think of olives. This would make sense. In ancient times, you crush the olive to get the olive oil, and I bet you can think of the other one. Grapes. Certainly you would press grapes for wine. I think you probably think of that one as well. I think that all should make sense to you. So his printing press to print documents is really based on other inventions. Okay, so what we should really give him credit for is movable type. All right, I've got some props here. I'll get to those in a second. What we should really credit him with credit to him is movable type. And so what you have to sort of imagine is, you remember those old typewriters? You'd whack the key and the thing would come flying up from underneath there, and it would hit the ribbon and would leave an impression. And you look down there, and there was pieces of metal. There were metal keys, if you will, and you could see that there was raised. The letter was raised on that piece of metal. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is really sort of what he deserves credit for. Remember, this is a business operation. He's not out there to change the world as far as education and those types of things, and he's out there to make money. So let me sort of make you imagine what we're sort of thinking here. So what I want you to do is I'm going to pull this off here, and I want you to sort of think about this. I want you to imagine that this screen, okay, is a piece of wood, is a wood square, like so. Okay, a wood square. Does this make sense what I'm saying? And basically what we're going to do is we're going to pack, and I'm going to use this cool thing, my vanilla shake. I'm going to use this as my prop. And so what you have to imagine is this maybe a small piece of metal, maybe that big. And what you have is on the top of this small piece of metal is a raised letter. Okay? And so what we're going to do with these things is, what he really does is he mass produces these little pieces of metal with letters on the top. So let's say he's going to write a book, he's got a workshop, and he's got a bunch of people working on various pages, and some guy's got page 1 of whatever book. And the book, we're going to take it from writing to printing, and the first line of the book is "Once upon a time." Okay, so what does the worker do? He goes to the shelf and he grabs a piece of metal that has, you need an indentation to start a paragraph. Then he goes over to the shelf and he goes to the box of capital O's, and he pulls out a piece of metal that has a capital O on it. And then what does he do? He packs it into the wood. Right? Remember, I got a wooden frame here. Okay. Then he goes over to the lowercase n's and he pulls out a lowercase n and he packs that sucker right in there. And he would go, see, mine are way bigger, obviously. Okay. And then he would fill in this wooden frame all the way full with these pieces of metal with raised letters, right? So that's why I use this thing, because it's raised. Okay, so the letter, it's not round, it's got a small lowercase n right there. Then you would then what you would do is you would paint ink on top of it. So the lowercase n, the big O, has ink on the top of it. And then you would take a piece of paper, you would take another piece of paper, right? And you would lay it on top of these things, all right, and you kind of see them through there. And then what would you do with the piece of paper? You would press it down, thus the printing press. You pull the press up, you pull the piece of paper away, and guess, sure enough, what would you have? Once upon a time. And so you got some guy working on page 1, you got some guy working on page 2, you got somebody working on page 3, you got some people in the back that are, back there that are binding these things all together once they get the pages. And so basically one person was responsible for one page at a time. But the point of this whole thing is, this is mass production, isn't it? All right, this is, you need to think about books, anything written before the printing press is literally written, isn't it? And so how long does it take for a person to write a book? It takes a long time, all right? So the key to this whole thing is, if I write a book by hand, I want to be compensated for my time that it took to write the book. Therefore, the book is going to be extremely expensive. You can see here, as books are mass produced one page at a time, it may seem kind of tedious, I grant you, but the person who's making page 1 can make multiple page 1s, can't he? And therefore, you can see, you can mass produce, and obviously when you have mass production, what happens to the price of that thing? It becomes cheaper. And now you have a situation where books, things that are written, are now available to the lower classes. And this is the key to this whole thing, isn't it? This is the very big key thing. And let me make a differentiation here. This is very important, between Europe and China. The Chinese, who I said just a moment ago and deserve credit for inventing printing, the Chinese said, we are basically going to keep the printed word hidden from the lower classes. The elites of China, remember I've discussed the elites in my political spectrums, haven't I? The elites of China kept the written word away from the lower classes. Okay? This is a very, very important aspect of this whole thing. Europe, on the other hand, the written word, it wasn't overnight, it took a while. The lower classes were exposed to the written word. And so this, to me, my argument is, China at 1492 closed itself off. It closed itself off from the rest of the world. Europe in 1492, you had a you had a continent of curious people. What do curious people do? They want to go explore. How does that sound? That's an interesting way to sort of look at it. The very first book that Gutenberg printed was the Bible. All right, that was his very first. That was his very first thing that he ever put out there. All right. Now I think there's a little bit of irony to this, and we sort of talked about this. We talked about this with the scientific revolution the other day, didn't we? Here he is, he's printing the Bible, and what's ironic about that, if you think about it, is that the Bible was being attacked by various groups of people at this time, and not necessarily question. Maybe probably the better thing would be the Roman Catholic Church was being the book that represented the Roman Catholic Church at this particular moment in time began to be criticized. So Renaissance artists, Protestants, scientists, these are people that are going to be helped by printing. And what do they all have in common? They're attacking the Roman Catholic Church. So I find that to be quite ironic. Now, let's you may say, well, this is the greatest thing ever. This is the most important invention of all time. Well, guess who didn't like the printing press? Dictators. Dictators hate the printing press. They despise it. And so they have to have two strategies on how to deal with the printing press. And one of those strategies is, well, what do? You destroy the product that comes out of a printing press. You burn books. You destroy printing presses. You arrest authors. You put authors in jail. You put authors to death. All right, so the first thing that dictatorships, and remember now, dictators don't want an educated group of people, because educated people ask why. Dictators do not want to be asked why. Dictators want to be able to dictate. All right, so now the next thing that dictators do, and again, this classic, the dictators start collecting printing presses, and they start printing their own propaganda. And I have told you that this is a very important part of this story. All of the modern oligarchs, all the modern dictators, what's the very first thing they try to get control of when they get in power is they take control of education. And what is taught the mindset of the dictator's own ideology. I would argue that the printing press makes the concept of democracy and the idea of self-rule more inevitable. So we basically say 1455, you know, okay, Columbus this, and the Renaissance that, and the Age of Exploration that. A lot of people, you make the argument that none of that gets off the ground if it's not for this particular man and his particular invention. Okay, so here's another little irony for you. He made 180 Bibles, all right, total. That was his first job. That was his first contract. He made 180 Bibles. And remember, what does the printing press do to the price of books? Well, it reduces the price of books. But did you know that there are only 43 known surviving what are known as Gutenberg Bibles today? There's only 43 in the whole world. I think the United States owns 2 of them. When we go to Washington, D.C., we always see them there. But there's only 43 known. If you find the 44th, you're going to be a rich person. Okay, so isn't that fascinating? What is the importance of Gutenberg? Well, I would say it increases any individual's ability to be educated. Any individual. I think this is a great moment. You can make the argument this is a great moment for women, because in most cases in ancient times and throughout history, women were not educated. This is a great moment for women. This is a great blow to slavery. Slaves, of course, slaves were kept uneducated. This is an opportunity for slaves many slaves secretly try to educate themselves. This is a great moment in that fight. What's the first things that are printed? History books, certainly. Well, I think that would make sense to you. The first thing we do is we print history books, and so a lot of the what you can not necessarily forgotten, but not necessarily remembered history, especially of the Greeks and the Romans, as you would guess, is suddenly being printed and being reintroduced to the world. That helps with the modern era, the Renaissance. You know, I sort of mentioned this, I mentioned this before, the idea of Gutenberg's time periods spread at this time. You know, the Renaissance is just getting started as Gutenberg's life comes to an end. The Renaissance certainly could not have moved. I'm going to just tell you about a Renaissance artist here in a moment. We talked about Martin Luther, and remember his 95 Theses? Well, you know, he put that up on the door of his church after a couple days. You know what he did with his 95 Theses list? He took it down and he walked over to the local print shop to get copies created. We talked about Copernicus and Galileo and Newton, and their writings are known to people because of what? Because of this invention. Okay? All right, so Gutenberg, super, super interesting and super, super important. All right, try another piece of paper here, and I think you'll find this one interesting. This guy right here, his name is Niccolo Machiavelli. So here's your last wit up of the year, everybody. Okay? Niccolo Machiavelli, he was a Italian author. Okay, and we call him a humanist. And I sort of bring him up last because he's also kind of hits upon our discussion of politics. This is something to sort of think about when you think about the political spectrum. He certainly had an opinion about this. Okay? All right, so this author, what's a humanist, Mr. O'Brien? Okay. First of all, notice his dates that he's alive, just like I mentioned, you know, Gutenberg, and these guys are alive at the time of Columbus. They're alive at the time. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo is alive, Machiavelli, Michelangelo alive at the same time. Machiavelli certainly saw the Sistine Chapel ceiling live at the time of the conquistadors. The Reformation happens during the life of Machiavelli. All right, so what's a humanist? A humanist is somebody who studies the potential of humans, humanism. King Henry VIII was a great, very well-known humanist. And when we see the word potential, what we mostly think of is something positive. In education, we always talk about, oh, that kid's got great potential. Potential for good, potential for greatness, potential to do awesome things. So we usually think of potential in a positive manner. So let's think about that. Remember that sort of in the back of your head as we go through. Machiavelli's most famous book is called The Prince. And it's a very interesting sort of book. It's not very long. You can find it at Barnes & Noble and online very simply. It's a discussion about leadership and leading. And Machiavelli makes the argument that there's really only two types of leaders out there. There's only two ways to lead other people. And he said that ruling by fear and cruelty was the most effective way to rule. You know, basically there's two arguments. Rule by fear or rule by love? Which is the best way to do it? Well, certainly Machiavelli said ruling by fear is the best way. It's the best way to be a ruler. Okay, now you may say, oh my God, that's terrible. What a terrible person. And that's what a lot of people said about him. He basically said, well, I'm just writing a book. I'm writing a book as sort of an advice book or a guidebook for somebody to become a leader, to gain power, and not only gain it, to maintain it. And I guess here's what I would say. What is the only other job a prince could, what is the only other job a prince would want? A prince doesn't want to go sideways. A prince doesn't want to go down in status. A prince wants to go where? Up. Become a king. So you're a prince, you want to become a king, read my book. This is an advice book and a guidebook on how to do that. And again, you may say, this guy's the worst guy ever. Okay, just let's listen here a little bit longer. What are some other themes that he said? Okay, well, how do you create fear? Well, you have to have some serious rules and laws, and if people break those rules and laws, you have to commit your punishments publicly, and you have to let people see how cruel you are to instill fear. So what does this mean? Well, this means when people are put to death, where do you do it? You do it in front of everybody. You make people come out and watch it. People see that, they go, well, I'm not going to do what that person did because I don't want that to happen to me. That creates fear within a society. All right, and I'm sure you think of it. I mean, certainly, this is the norm of ancient history. This happens in modern times, in modern history, with the terrible dictatorships that we've seen in the 20th century. Who's going to do it for you? Well, you've got to have your military. Remember, I always said, what is all military's original purpose? It's really a police force. It's really to enforce laws. So who do you have to get to do that for you? Well, you've got to get loyal people. If you're a prince and you want to become a king, and you become a king, you've got to get loyal people. Who are the most likely people to be loyal to you? Well, probably your nation's native citizens. You're not going to necessarily, slaves, for example, are not going to be loyal necessarily. Why would a slave be loyal to their enslavers? They wouldn't be. That's the problem that happened with the Romans. Mercenaries, people that pay people to fight for you. Well, mercenaries are great if they're fighting for you today. The problem is somebody might pay them more tomorrow and they're fighting against you. So who is the most likely group of people that is going to be willing to fight for you? Native citizens, and you make them super loyal by making sure they're well funded. Okay? And I would also say the other thing is that Machiavelli would say that 10 Commandments stuff, that's a waste of your time. Don't even bother with. Do not ignore the 10 Commandments. Ignore morality if you want to get in charge and stay in charge. And this is one of the reasons why. Look, why are these dictators, not just of modern times, of all time, so cruel? Why are they so cruel? Well, what have they basically said? By whatever means necessary. no morals are going to slow us down. Now, as you are correctly thinking to yourself, this guy is, I'm sure people said he was a terrible person, and that's exactly what they said about him when his book came out. While he was still alive and his book was out, he was attacked a lot. He was criticized a lot for this book. He said his defense was, oh, hold on now, my book is nothing new. There's not one new thing that I've written here. In fact, I have written a history book, really. If you want to be honest about it, I've written a history book. My book is realistic. All of you who say that ruled by love is the best way, that's naive. That's foolish, and that's not how humans are. That's a foolish way to look at it. Humans have always been this way that I'm talking about right now. Okay, so now briefly, what is the importance of Machiavelli as we come to the end here? Well, let's go back to that word potential. And again, I sort of commented that most of the time when you think of the word potential, it's used in a positive spin. Well, what is Machiavelli arguing? I think he's arguing with, unfortunately, you have to admit that there's something to this book, that there's an element of realism to this book. He's making the argument that humans have the potential for bad. Humans have the potential for evil as well. And we need to keep this in mind. Really, you can make the argument it might be an advice, a guidebook. It could be an advice and a guidebook to all of us, couldn't it? Because this tells us what? That the reality is there's evil in the world. There's going to be evil people in the world, and you've got to be realistic about that. That would be his argument. His book was influential. Machiavelli never was a king, never held a political office. He never did anything to become a ruler himself. But people of his own time period did, and dictatorships of later times. We know Napoleon, for example, Napoleon carried his copy of The Prince with him wherever he went. We know that Mussolini apparently had a personal copy that he carried with him. But you'd have to look at Hitler and Stalin and these types of guys. This is ruling by fear is certainly what all these modern dictators have done. The problem that you would have to sort of argue with here, you would have to say here, is what does the prince unfortunately do? The prince unfortunately gives these guys an excuse for their actions. It justifies in their mind the actions, the terrible cruelties that they commit. So that's a very important thing to remember, and this is what I mean. This is why these dictators never give up. This is because they believe that there's an excuse out there for them. Okay? Now, is that exactly Machiavelli's intention? Probably not, but you would have to admit that is part of this whole thing. Okay, so let me just read you a brief selection from the book. How's that sound? Here are the questions. This is directly from the Prince. Here the question arises: whether it is better to be loved than feared, or feared than loved. The answer is that would be desirable to be both. But since that is difficult, it is much safer to be feared than to be loved if one must choose. For all men in general, this observation may be made. They are ungrateful, fickle, and deceitful, eager to avoid dangers, and avid for gain. And while you are useful to them, they are all with you, offering their blood, their property, their lives, their sons, so long as danger is remote. But when it approaches, they turn on you. Any prince, trusting only in their words and having no other preparations made, will fall to ruin. For friendships that are bought at a price, and not by greatness and nobility of soul, are paid for indeed, but they are not owned and cannot be called upon in time of need. Men have less hesitation in offending a man who is loved than one who is feared. For love is held by a bond of obligation, which, as men are wicked, is broken whenever personal advantage suggests it. But fear is accompanied by the dread of punishment, which never relaxes. So you can see what is his opinion. You can see what is his opinion of the potential of humanity. It's a pretty negative view of humanity, doesn't it? But he wouldn't say it's negative. He would say, if he stood before you, he would say, I'm the one being realistic. I'm making an argument of realism over idealism. And so hopefully you can see maybe here a little bit of what I'm getting at when we talk about the political spectrums when we talk about politics in general, this is something else to keep in mind. What is realistic? What is idealistic? All right, everyone? Okay. There you have it. The content of world history, the end of the WITIPs, the end of the write it down periods. Right there. I hope you found those two subjects interesting. I think they're very interesting topics, both of them. And I hope you enjoyed the discussion today. All right, everybody. I will see you tomorrow. Aloha.